Hello everyone. 1 Timothy 3:16, King James Version. And that reads as follows: Great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh. And so this verse is sometimes used to promote Trinitarian doctrine. And oddly enough, people that usually don't read the King James Version will appeal to this verse and sort of cherry pick, the King James Version of this verse, even though they usually don't read the King James Bible anyway. And that's because in the modern translations of this verse, it usually says something like, he appeared in a body, or he was manifest in flesh, or who was manifest in flesh, maybe which was manifested in flesh, or something to that effect. Now there's a good reason, just like 1 John 5:7, there's a good reason that scholars and textual critics can be reasonably certain that this King James version of this verse is not what Paul wrote. It's not authentic. And so that's why modern translations don't read, God was manifest in the flesh. Our best manuscript evidence very strongly indicates that this is a scribal corruption. Whether it was intentional or unintentional, it's a corruption nevertheless. They think they know how it probably happened to a certain point. The only thing is we can't be sure whether it was intentional or unintentional. Scribes use something called nomina sacra. And what they were are just abbreviations of several key words which appear a lot in the scriptures. And they did that to save time and space, because it's a lot of work for a scribe to write out a New Testament, for example. And so the word God, they had an abbreviation for the Greek word for God and Lord and Christ and Jesus and several other words. They call these nomina sacra. They're just really abbreviations. Well, it turns out that if Paul had originally written who was manifested in the flesh, that the word there could easily be changed to God was manifest in the flesh with just a couple of pen strokes. Bang, bang, done. And you would basically turn the Greek omicron into a theta just by putting a pen stroke through it. It looks like the letter O. If you want to see what it looks like, just go to my website. I'll put a link below this video, and you can get a visual on this. But all it would take was a pen stroke to change it from who to God. And so it would be pretty easy to corrupt this scripture. Now, it might have not been an intentional thing. What could have happened is that he wrote who was manifest in the flesh, and then he turned the page over and wrote some stuff on the back page, and the ink bled through enough at that very point so it looked like God was manifested in the flesh. All it would take was a little blob to bleed through the media, and it would change that word. It'd be that simple. And some people think that's maybe what happened here. And then that particular copy was used to make more copies and more copies, and that's why there's copies of manuscripts out there that have this King James reading. But our best manuscripts don't have that reading. Our best manuscripts have, who was manifest in the flesh. Perhaps it originally said which was manifested in the flesh. I think it probably said who. It was a constructio ad sensum, and it said who was manifest in the flesh. That's what I think it originally said. So that we know by the manuscript evidence that we can be reasonably certain that Paul didn't write God was manifest in the flesh. Now, if we take for the sake of argument, let's just pretend Paul did write, God was manifest in the flesh. Well, we could say that means God the Father was manifest in flesh. John tells us that. No one has ever seen God, but guess what? Jesus expresses him or declares him. Right? He said, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And he explains, you have seen the Father in the works that I'm doing. Why? The Father abiding in me does the works. You see, so even if this verse was authentic, it still doesn't prove the Trinity. It still wouldn't. But as it is, we can be very sure that this is not what Paul wrote. There's also, there's more stuff that I could say about this. You can click on the link on my website and see the other stuff. There's also something interesting that I don't have on my article on my website. I still have to add it, but there's internal evidence right here in this verse that tells you something is wrong with the King James Version. I'm just going to read it in the King James fashion. God was manifest in the flesh. And we'll read the rest of the verse and see kind of what we end up with. Great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh. God was justified in the Spirit. God was seen by angels. God was preached among the nations. God was believed on in the world. God was taken up into glory. I don't think so. That's not going to ever really make any sense, is it? God was justified in the Spirit. Some translations you might see vindicated. It's the standard word for justified. God was justified in the Spirit. Is that ever going to make any sense? You think any Jewish Christian would write that God was justified in the Spirit? Or that God was seen by angels? What sense is that going to make? Isn't God always seen by angels? I mean, isn't that kind of a redundant statement? God was seen by angels. Oh, yeah. I mean, you read in the Old Testament how God's always surrounded by angels. Why would Paul write God was seen by angels? Or God was taken up in glory? What sense is that statement going to have? Like, what meaning is there? It doesn't have any meaning. Especially in the context of the New Testament and Paul's writings. You just end up with these silly implications to the King James reading of this verse. But if it says, great is the mystery of godliness, who was manifest in the flesh? A man named Jesus. The mystery of godliness is manifested in him. It was always God's plan. He, Jesus, justified in the Spirit. Jesus seen by angels, the man Jesus. Jesus is preached among the nations. Jesus is believed on in the world. The man Jesus is glorified. The man Jesus is taken up in glory. Well, then it makes sense. Then you have a likely reading of this verse. But to have God was manifest in the flesh, God was justified in the Spirit, God seen by angels, God taken up in glory. Get real. You have to be rather disingenuous with yourself to believe that Paul would have said things like that. God taken up in glory, God justified in the Spirit, God justified in his own Spirit. It's nonsense. And so, we can really just see it right in the internal evidence, in the very context that something is wrong. And the manuscripts tell us that something, is very wrong with the King James reading of this verse. And not only that, we know how it probably got corrupted. It'd just take a couple of ink blobs or ink strokes to change that into the word God. Very, very simple. And, we have our manuscripts that don't read that way. very early manuscripts that don't say the word God there. And, 4th century Trinitarian types aren't going to be doing that. Even the Arians don't want to do that. Who's going to do it? It doesn't make any sense when you start looking at all the evidence to believe that the King James reading of this verse could possibly be correct. And then you have the fact that, early Christians didn't really bring up this verse. You don't see it until late in the 4th century, after the Trinitarians are kind of winning the day. And one of the Gregories starts mentioning this a lot. And that's where you first kind of see it show up, after Trinitarian doctrine is kind of in place. Then all of a sudden this verse becomes God was manifest in the flesh. Now that's not to suggest that someone had an intentional corruption here or intentionally corrupted it. It just might mean that one of the Gregory, I can't remember which one, there's 2 Gregories working at this time, maybe saw this particular manuscript and seized upon it. Oh, look at that. It says God was manifest in the flesh. Could be that he was just ignorant that this was a corruption. I don't know. Things are too obscure in the past, but we have enough facts to know that Paul didn't write that God was manifest in the flesh. And as I said before, even if he did, it still wouldn't prove the Trinity. It would just prove that Jesus manifested the Father. The Father was manifested in the flesh of Jesus. He was. Jesus said so. And that's all it would say, even if it was authentic. So once again, you have this situation where Trinitarians are quoting verses without, really being honest about the facts here. There's a good reason this does not appear in modern translations. And people need to be aware of it. People should be aware of this verse in 1 John 5:7. That should be a no-brainer. But for some reason, Trinitarians, especially lay people, still appeal to these verses. And it's not just King James only people doing it. Many others are doing it as well. People who don't normally read the King James Bible. And it's really kind of dishonest. Even if you can dream up justifications for this verse or for 1 John 5:7, you've still got nothing. You have to absolutely prove that this is what this verse said, or you don't have a fact to base anything upon. All you have is your own wishful desires, really, that this is what the verse originally said. You have to have absolute proof. If this verse is just suspicious or questionable, that's it, you're done. You have proof of nothing. That's why in a court of law, if there's evidence that's suspicious, it's just chucked out of court. You can't use it as a fact. It's too suspicious. And we're beyond the suspicious, level here. We can go back and look in early manuscripts and see, no, this verse didn't say that. I think there's one early manuscript where it does. But I think that's the one where some people think the ink bled through the media. And when you look at the best manuscripts that we have, the best evidence that we have, there's no way that Paul wrote this. So you need to, just honestly consider things like that. You have to honestly consider the evidence when you're looking at some of this. God bless you.